Okay. So yes, if you need to ask a question, just to unmute your end. Oh, what is it doing? Okay, so I'm just going to open up. So what I thought I'd do is go through the page, the assessment instructions with you all. And then what I'll do is I'll go through the marking rubric and then we can look at some examples as well. Just going to just make sure. Can you see the LMS page? No, you can't. Okay, it's not. How's that? Can you see that now? Yeah, cool. I'll just move this out the way here. All right, so if I open up the reflective piece instructions, which I've already done down here, I'll have it go through these. If you've got any questions anytime, unmute, feel free to ask me and you seek clarification as we're going through. Then what I'll do is I'll go through that marking rubric with you and then we'll look at some examples as well. So this assessment really builds on a lot of what we've been doing in the subject around cultural safety, cultural competence, but also some of that reflective work that we've been getting you to do. So thinking back in week 5 where we introduced cultural competence and cultural safety, and we also asked you to reflect on your own culture, some of that will come into play in this particular assessment. So there's a couple of premises underlying this particular assessment. So one is that rural and remote populations are made up of culturally diverse populations. So I think that it's really important that we recognise that there isn't just one rural culture, that, you know, rural and remote communities are very diverse. You know, there's a whole range of, you know, socio-cultural factors that come into play. So that's one of the premises underlying this particular assessment. As well as sharing many attributes, humans have significant cultural distinctions. Valuing cultural diversity and cultural competence is part of a responsive and equitable healthcare system, which is why we are getting you to examine these particular concepts in this subject. And then you can see here the final premise is that what really matters to the person at the centre of care is how the health professional responds to them in any particular encounter. And so this assessment is getting you to reflect on your cultural values and then to think about how they might come into play when you are working with patients or clients or communities. When we're talking about cultural safety, we're referring to more or less an environment that is safe for people, where there is no assault, challenge or denial of their identity, of who they are and what they need. And it's about shared respect, shared meaning, shared knowledge and experience of learning, living and working together with dignity and truly listening. So part of what we will be expecting to see from you in this particular assessment, particularly in part 2, is around how are you going to create this you know, shared understanding, shared meaning, and how are you going to work in a way that ensures that your communities are culturally safe. So there's a couple of important things to remember before you write this assessment. And one is that cultural safety is relevant to all groups of peoples and individuals. We're not just talking about those who identify as Indigenous Australians or who are refugees. You know, cultural safety is just as relevant to, you know, middle class white Anglo-Saxons. You know, so it doesn't matter what people's ethnic background is, what race, religion, age, gender. Cultural safety is relevant to everybody. What we see, there's a tendency for people to view these groups as relatively homogenous, and we saw that in your essays, particularly with students who focused on Indigenous Australians, that there were some assumptions and some generalisations that this particular population group are homogenous, and that there's not, you know, cultural diversity within that particular population group. So just want you to remember that, you know, these groups are not the same, that there are different cultures within these particular subpopulation groups. There can be both similarities and differences within and across cultural groups. So being sensitive to this diversity aids in providing quality, safe and equitable care. And just be mindful about not slipping into that stereotyping language. And again, we saw this coming through in the essays, mostly with students who were focusing on Indigenous populations. And there were a number of students who we just had to, make that reminder around the language and the way that you are writing is perpetuating and reinforcing these stereotypes. It is leading to victim blaming, and you're also making some assumptions about this particular population group that are just not very well supported with evidence. Okay. And then the other important thing to remember that cultural safety is about the experience of the patient or the client or the community. And so this assessment is around what impact you as a practitioner might have in creating a culturally safe service for these people. It's not so much about your level of cultural safety, but it's how you're going to work to ensure that they are culturally safe. Just some little details about assignment submission. So these are sort of the stock standard things that we would be expecting. Just ensuring that you've got your name, student number, course and year level in the footer of your assignment. This assignment should be obviously submitted via LMS, either as a Word or a PDF. We don't mind which one. We've said that this is equivalent to a 1,000 word essay, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the distinctions between an essay and this particular task a little bit later on, but your word count is the 1,000 words plus or minus 10%. Look, we're not hard and fast on that plus or minus 10%, that we would rather that you went over the word count and did a really good job of thinking and demonstrating how you would be working in a culturally safe manner, rather than trying to stick to, a 1,000 word, 1,100 words. So if you need to go to 1,500, even 1,800 words, I certainly don't have a problem with that, and I'll certainly talk to the facilitators around that students won't be penalised for that. What I don't want to see, however, is you writing 2,000 or 3,000 words, because we also have to take into consideration what the overall weighting of the assessment is. So I don't want you writing 2,000, 3,000 words. But if you go over the plus or minus 10% of it, that's absolutely fine. This is a reflective piece, and so we absolutely expect that you will write in the first person. Unlike your essay where it needed to be written in third person, this is reflective. It is, you reflecting on your values around your culture, challenges that you might experience in practice, and therefore it's perfectly reasonable to assume that you would use words such as I, me, and my where it's appropriate. Okay, this doesn't need to be written in third person. All right, so the assessment itself, so the whole purpose of this is to begin to critically reflect on your own cultural competence and to apply the concept of culturally safe practice to rural communities. And there are two parts to this assessment, and each of these parts has a couple of sections. So the first part one, is about being able to provide culturally safe practice and being aware of social and cultural factors. So when you're structuring your reflective task, I would encourage you to set it up using headings that are reflective of the instructions here. And I'll show you some examples around how students have done that. My preference would be that you, have headings that are reflective of each of these sections within the individual parts. Okay, this one leaves facilitators with no doubt that you've addressed each of the required sections, and it means that then our job becomes much easier. It's about then looking at to what extent and how well have you actually addressed the criteria for each of these. It makes it much more difficult if you don't use headings or structure it in just part A and part B. It means we have to then go searching for each of these things. It just makes our job a little bit more difficult. So in part A, the first thing that you need to do is to identify a cultural factor that you might encounter in a rural or remote setting that would be a challenge for you in a professional setting. So we've given you some examples there. So it might be, for example, that you don't believe in same-sex attraction, but you've got a young man who's attending your clinic to talk about his issues with you. It could be that you believe in equal rights for men and women, but you might find yourself working in a really conservative and traditional community that perhaps doesn't share those same views as you. So the first thing is to do some of that reflecting around, well, what would I find challenging and why do I find it challenging? So unpacking and reflecting on what are your values, what are your cultural beliefs, and why do you actually find this a particular challenge in this particular setting. So that's the first bit, and I'll go shortly. We'll have a look at some examples around these. Part B, or section B in part 1, is given that valuing cultural diversity and cultural competence is part of a responsive and equitable healthcare system, how would you approach the above situation? Okay, so you need to then take this this concept that you would find challenging, or this cultural factor that you would find challenging, and then discuss how you would approach that particular situation in a professional context. Okay, and then the third part of this is to briefly outline how such a cultural factor impacts on the health of rural populations or a specific rural population. So in that section there, you could actually pick a specific community. It might be the same community that you looked at in your essay. Or you can look at rural populations more broadly in this. So what I might do is we might just go to have a look at an example around this first part. So I've put up on LMS some examples of part A. So there's 3 examples within the document, each of them showing a different way of structuring this first part of the reflective task. So the first example here, you'll see that this one just uses the headings part 1 and then part 2, which is fine.
Karen,
yeah.
Just letting you know, all we can see is the LMS screen.
Sorry?
Just letting you know, all we can see is the LMS screen.
Right, so you can't see what I've got up now?
No.
Okay, let's have a look, see. I probably just need to stop share. I'll share again. How's that?
Yeah, that's better.
Great. I'll just probably need to just stop sharing and restart it every time I switch to a different document. Thanks for letting me know. Okay, so what you can see here, these are the examples that I've put up on LMS, and each of them is structured in a slightly different way. So this first one, you'll see it uses just the headings part 1, and as you scroll down, then just uses part 2. So it doesn't necessarily or easily identify each of those sections within the parts. Not necessarily a problem. It does make our job as examiners just a little bit more difficult, that's all. What you will see here is that we've done some annotations of each of these examples. So these are not necessarily the most perfect or the best examples, but what we've done is we've annotated them to show you both the good things that the students have done and also how that is reflective of the marking rubric and the instructions, but also where there are opportunities for improvement as well. So you can see in this one, in this example here, that the student has identified the cultural factor that they would find challenging. So in this case, they're concerned with language barriers. Okay, they then explain why they would actually find this challenging, and this has been based on their own culture and their background. So they're bringing in some of that reflection of who they are and their own culture and their beliefs, and have linked that to why they would find this challenging. You can see as you go down that they explain why this would be challenging based on their own cultural background. and then they've provided a rationale for the cultural factor being experienced in their discipline. So when you look at the marking rubric actually says that you need to, in order to get that higher mark, so an A assessment for this section, it would provide, the student has identified that a relevant cultural factor that they would find challenging. There's a logical and evidence-based rationale that's provided for why this would be encountered in the discipline's practice. So when you're thinking about a cultural factor that's challenging, you need to think about something that you are likely to experience, and then provide a rationale for why you're likely to experience that in practice. Okay. So in this case, the student has talked about that language barriers are one of the key issues that contribute to the poor uptake of health promotion programs for Aboriginal people. Okay. They explain why this would be, again, we'll go on to further explain why this would be a personal challenge. Here you can see as you start to move down, they've provided a rationale for why this would be encountered in a rural or remote setting within their discipline. And that this could provide here what we're saying is that they could provide some population statistics just to support that. So really, showing that strong evidence base as to why this might be an issue that's likely to be encountered. You can see that they then go on to start to think about how they would actually approach this situation. And what we see here is that they're recognising the value in cultural diversity here as well. So you can see as they start to move through, I'm not going to read all of these, you can go back and reflect on these, but as you're looking at these examples, look at the annotations that we've provided, look at the instructions for the assessment, and look at the marking rubric. You can't write this assessment just based on the instructions. You need to be looking at the rubric as well, because there is actually more detail and more guidance in that marking rubric about how to tackle each of these sections. Okay, so that's one way, is just to use the headings part A, part 1 and part 2. I'll come back to part 2 shortly. This one here, so this is another example. In this example that they've used headings, and this would be my preference for how you structure it. So they're talking about encountering men's and women's business. So the challenge is around gender-specific practices. In this particular case, they're looking at in Indigenous communities. So this is sort of that part 1 or section 1 of part 1. So they clearly identified what the factor is. Then they go on to with the heading around how they would actually respond to that. And then they've got the impact of culture on certain Indigenous communities. So that's section 3 in that first part of the assignment. So that would be my preference for how you do structure the assessment. As I said, it leaves the examiners with no doubt that you've addressed each of the main sections. Our job then just becomes to assess that and look at how well you've done that and have you met the criteria. The third example that we've provided, so this one doesn't use any headings at all. It does have an introduction, which is not necessary. So this is not a traditional essay style assessment. It's perfectly fine to use headings. You could use subheadings if you felt that was necessary. You don't need an introduction. You don't need a conclusion. Yes, it's really just about addressing those questions or those sections within each part. If you can answer and address those, then you've done the task. Okay. Having said that, while this student has included an introduction, there is content in here that would actually attract marks. Okay, so it is another way of setting up the assessment, probably not the preferred method, but in saying that if you did structure it like this, you wouldn't be penalised for doing it. Okay, it just makes it a bit more difficult for us to assess. That's the only difference. Has anyone got any questions at this point? If you do, just unmute and shout out. No, we're all good? All right, so I'll just stop sharing that. I'll go back to the, where are we? Let's go to this bit here. So this is go back to the assignment instructions. So can you all see that? Someone give me a nod. Yep, good, excellent. All right, so part B, so that was part A. So there's those, so in part A, where are I? So that was part A. So this is the second part, which is around developing culturally safe practice requires continued reflection and attention. So in this section, you're developing a plan for achieving cultural safety as a health professional in rural Australia. And there's two sections to this. The first section is briefly outlining your understanding of cultural safety. And how this applies to working in rural and remote Australia. And so that's the critical bit. It's all good and well to say that you understand what cultural safety is, but you actually need to demonstrate to us how it actually applies to working in rural or remote Australia. Okay. And then the second part of this section is around creating and complete a table to outline your plan to continue developing your cultural competency and safety for working in rural, remote areas of Australia. So what does that look like? So I'll go back to the examples. If I scroll down, so you'll see in that, so we've got so in that first example, we've got part one. In part two, scroll down, you can see here that here's where the student starts to demonstrate their understanding of culture and of rural and remote areas. When you're talking about, the culture in rural and remote areas, we want you to think beyond just the she'll be right sort of attitude that's quite renowned within rural communities. We actually want you to be thinking about the diversity of cultures that are in rural and remote communities. And then thinking about this concept of cultural safety and thinking about what cultural safety practice might look like, and make sure that you are also referencing this bit as well. This section only needs to be brief. So you can see here, the student has only written a paragraph in this example. If we scroll down to example 2, here they've used the heading Achieving Cultural Safety Practice as a Healthcare Professional in Rural Australia. And you can see in this example here that the concept and the purpose of cultural safety is expressed clearly and that they've referenced that. They talk about cultural safety within rural and remote Australia, and why that's important. And so here they are, recognising and acknowledging that, that rural communities are culturally diverse. Okay. As we scroll down, they talk about the concept of what culturally resilient communities and environments look like. There's some issues around how some of this could be expressed, and so we've made some notes of that in those annotations. So as I said, these are not necessarily, perfect examples. They've certainly, some of them have had really good marks, but of course there's always room for improvement in any student work. So we've identified where some of those improvements could be made. So again, you can see that in that in part 2, that first section, it's only quite brief. Okay, I'll leave you to go back and have a look at that and the annotations around that. What I will show you is an example of the table, because this is often the part that students will struggle with the most. So what we've done, we've included just one example of a cultural safety plan in the instructions for the assessment. You use these headings up here. So we want you to use the headings. We want you to tell us what your learning objectives are around how you're going to achieve cultural safety. You need to link these learning objectives to cultural safety steps. Okay, so that might be, you know, those steps around things like cultural sensitivity, cultural awareness, cultural safety, but you could also think about some of the principles as well. And so the actions that relate to how you're going to achieve these learning objectives should be relating to those cultural safety principles. So, you know, the partnerships, protection, personal knowledge, protocols, etc. These should be referenced. Okay, when you're talking about cultural safety steps and you're talking about cultural safety principles, these are not your ideas. You're taking these from somewhere, so they really need to be referenced. And the other thing that we're looking for then as part of this plan is the resources that you would need and where you can actually source them. So what I'll do is I'm going to share with you an example. I haven't included this in LMS because I think it's way too tempting for students to copy this and then you run into all sorts of trouble with plagiarism. So I'm happy to go through it in this session, but this won't be going up on LMS. So this is an example of a cultural safety plan from a student. And I'll just talk you through some of the key points within this one. I might just move this over this side. All right, so I've annotated this as well, so you can always go back and watch the recording of this. So you can see here, in this case, the student is, one of their learning objectives is to form an understanding and respect of Indigenous culture. And so the comment around this is that this is consistent with Part A of their assessment and the cultural factor that they've identified would be challenging. So in this case, the student has identified that you know, working with Indigenous populations could be challenging and have identified a cultural factor around that. So that's that example around that men's and women's business. Okay. They've then linked that learning objective to a cultural safety step, and in this case they're talking about cultural awareness. Okay, and they explain what that is and why that is relevant to this particular learning objective. And again, you can see that they've provided a reference for that. Okay. Their actions relating to cultural safety principles, so they've linked, you know, that this learning objective to what actions would they actually take? How are they going to actually achieve this particular learning objective and using the steps or the principles of cultural safety as a way of identifying some actions. So here is where, you know, they said things, for example, like, you know, in terms of participating, that they would actually get involved in cultural safety events or practices within that Indigenous community. They've talked about partnerships. So, for example, you know, they might ask a fellow Indigenous staff member or a mentor to share their cultural knowledge or experience and to be a mentor for them when working with this particular community group. My comment here would be that these should be referenced. Okay, so the student, yep, they've referenced the cultural safety step, but they haven't referenced the principles. Okay, and then you can see here that they've then identified the resources that they would need and where they could source those in relation to each of those actions that they've identified. So in the case of you know, getting involved in cultural events or practices, they've identified that they would contact the local Indigenous council in order to be able to get a list of local community events. When you're thinking about your resources, you want to be specific. Okay, and so you can see my comment there. I'll just zoom in on that so that you can see that. So instead of just saying, and we see this sometimes, students would just say that they're going to go and talk to somebody, you know, so yeah, they've done a little bit of reflection, but we really want you to be quite specific. Who would you go and talk to? So what this does, by being specific, you're demonstrating that you've at least thought about and reflected on who you might actually need to go and speak to, what specific resources you would need to access, or where you could go to find out more, in this case, to get involved in local community events. And so using reflective methods just period is fine, just to say that you would go and talk to somebody, but it's not enough for an A paper. Okay, so what's going to set out, a D or a C or perhaps even a B paper from an A paper is that A paper is going to be really specific in terms of the resources that they need, and that that this is reflective of the cultural safety principles, the cultural safety steps, and reflects back on their learning objectives. Okay. We want you to be demonstrating that you can think about really practical day-to-day actions that you could incorporate into your working practice in order to be continually improving your cultural competence. Remembering that building cultural competence is an ongoing thing. It's not something that we just build and there's an endpoint. It's something that we are continuously working towards. Okay.
Can I ask a question? So with being specific about the places, do we have to literally name names and towns and then reference that, or do we just say a local Indigenous council? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it would depend, Hayley. It would depend on, so if you're going to look at a specific rural or remote community, then you would need to identify, in this case, you might identify who is the local Indigenous council, what's the name of that. You could certainly include that. But if you're taking a much broader approach to this and you're not necessarily talking about any specific rural community, then just acknowledging that you would go and contact the local Indigenous council is more than enough.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I had another question with the learning objectives.
Yep.
So they don't have to be like the SMART ones where you have like the by this time, by this, okay, cool.
Yeah, no. Because, Hayley, that you understand that because you've done a number of subjects where we've talked about SMART objectives, but we've got lots of students in this subject who would not have had that same level of background. So we just want you to think about what are the things that you would like to achieve in order to be, culturally competent and working in a way that is culturally safe for the community. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Karen, can I ask you a question?
Alana?
How many learning objectives are you expecting?
Look, you'll see in this example here, the student has come up with 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
3 or 4. Typically, most students will write 3 to 4.
Okay.
I think that's more than 4 is more than enough. 3 is probably a good number. I think if you've only got 1 or 2, that's probably not enough.
Yeah. Okay. And is what's in the table, is that included in the word count?
Yes. Yeah.
It is.
As I said, don't stress too much about that 1,000 words plus or minus 10%. As I said, if you need to go over that, that's fine. Alana, I might just get you to, it's got some background. So as you can see in this table, it's fine to use dot points. Okay, we're not expecting slabs of written information. That when the students are writing around what's the cultural safety step, you can see it's probably equivalent to a short paragraph with a reference. Most of it is just dot points, so that's not going to take up a whole lot of words. Okay, but yes, the table is included in the word count, but we're not really strict on that 1,000 words. As I say, I don't want you writing 3,000, because you just need to bear in mind the weighting of the assessment. Okay, so you can see that, as I say, I haven't put this example up on LMS, but what you do have is a different example. I'll just go back to. So we have put this one up in the instructions as an example, okay? And we've told you where you need to sort of reference that material as well, all right? Does anyone else have any other questions?
Karen, just a really quick question.
Yeah, who am I speaking to?
Joanne here.
Hi, Joanne.
Hello. I just wanted to ask, I had a bit of a confusing message coming across, but are the in-text citations included in the word count?
No.
All right, thank you.
No, they're not. So generally, the general rule of thumb is that direct quotes and in-text citations are not part of your word count. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we might just quickly, so I think that sort of covers each of the main sections. I'll just go to, so this is the marking guide. Or the marking rubric. So this assessment is worth 30% of your overall mark. We do mark this out of 100 and then we convert it to the 30% at the end. But you can see the weightings for each of the sections of the assessment. So in part 1, the cultural factors is worth 12%. And this is where I say you need to go and read the instructions for the assessment alongside the marking rubric, because the detail in here is much more than what we've provided in the instructions. Okay, so in terms of the cultural factor, you need to identify a cultural factor you may encounter in a rural or remote community that will be a challenge for you in a professional setting. And so in order to get the A, so you need to have identified the cultural factor that's relevant to working in a rural remote setting. This needs to be supported by some evidence. There's a logical and evidence-based rationale provided for why this would be encountered in your discipline, and the explanation for why this would be challenging is reflective of your own culture. So you can see there's a lot more detail in here than just what we've provided in the instructions. Okay. When you're thinking about the approaches to the situations, what we're looking for here is that you incorporate an approach that recognises diverse and multiple perspectives when working in the described situation, and that you're facilitating a shared understanding. So that's part of that, cultural awareness and cultural sensitivity. The impact of the factor on the rural and remote community. So this is worth 6% of the mark. So here, to get an A, that you succinctly and clearly articulate the impact of the cultural factor on rural and remote health. And as I said, you may look at specific rural populations, specific community, or you might like to keep that quite broad and just look at rural and remote more generally. Either one is fine. If you are going to look at a specific rural and remote community, then we would be expecting to see that then reflected in that cultural safety plan. And so that's where, Hayley, your question around, those resources and that, we would expect that you've at least thought about those resources within the context of that community. Okay. In part 2, so there's the understanding of cultural safety. So you need to briefly outline your understanding of cultural safety and how this applies to working in rural and remote Australia. So you can see that for an A, the concept and purpose of cultural safety has been expressed and connected to the principles or characteristics of cultural safety, and that cultural safety is applied and incorporated into the practice reality of working in rural and remote Australia. So there's 2 things that we're looking for there in an A paper. Your table is worth 15%. So that is that you create and complete a table to outline your plan. So to get the A, it's likely to be consistent with parts 1A and B. In developing cultural competence and safety, that you've incorporated a sense of curiosity. So that's that level of reflection, that you've drawn on cultural safety steps, principles and oral values within the plan, that you've got actions and resources that reflect realistic or actual practice examples. There's 15% attached to your writing, communication and presentation style. So, your thoughts are articulated with clarity, they're coherent, your ideas are well organised, good sentence and paragraph structure, no spelling or grammatical errors, or that they're minimal, and that all elements of the assessment are professionally presented and formatted. And then there's 15% attached to the reflective style. So what we're looking for in this assessment, because this is ultimately a reflective task, that you've demonstrated the ability to assess the impact of assumptions, judgments, and or biases related to your own culture as well as others, the culture of others. That you're personalising the challenging aspects of the cultural factor, so that you're telling us why you in particular would find this particularly challenging. And that you've thought about your own strengths and weaknesses in this. And, you know, we should be seeing that in that personalisation of why this factor is challenging, that perhaps, you know, you're lacking perhaps knowledge or skills or understanding, or are holding certain values that, you know, you are struggling to overcome or to change in order to be more culturally sensitive. But we would also be expecting to see this reflected in your table, that those strengths and weaknesses, and in particular the weaknesses, are opportunities for learning objectives. Okay, as well as, I mean, strengths can be also about how do you maintain those strengths that you have, could also form part of your learning objectives here as well. We're also looking in terms of the reflection that viewpoints and interpretations of cultural safety as it relates to your own practice are insightful, and that you've got clear examples where that's applicable. There are 10 marks, or 10% rather, attached to referencing as well, so that you're using full and accurate APA referencing throughout, that your appropriate sources are acknowledged and well integrated. There might just be some minor errors or no errors in terms of the style of both in-text and the reference list as well. I would avoid using direct quotes in this assessment. If you are, I would say no more than one. So, for example, it might be a good definition around what cultural safety is, but really this is about, you know, the reflection and the reflection on your culture and your values and your beliefs. I think that's probably all. Just go back to the assessment instructions. So I've given you some tips in terms of presentation and logic, but also how to prepare and complete each part of the assessment. So, you know, as with any assessment, it should be neatly presented with clear margins. Please use 1.5 line spacing, remembering that we have nearly 200 of these to mark, which can be quite a bit of a strain on the eyes. So it makes it much easier if you are using that 1.5 line spacing. When we're marking online, it makes it much easier to read if there's a bit of a gap between each of your lines. As I say, you should still be referencing any source that you use using APA. So, for example, when you're discussing steps or principles of cultural safety in particular, they must be referenced. They're not your ideas. Obviously, the reflection on your culture doesn't need to be referenced, but when you make that link to cultural safety or working in remote communities, that's when you would need to use the references. In terms of preparing for and completing part 1, so we've broken down into each of those sections. So part A, it can be really useful to draw on your own previous experiences of cultural factors, or even things that you've perhaps witnessed. Many of you will have probably, you know, participated in or have completed some sort of placement. Some of you are probably undertaking placement at the moment. So there may be things there that you have witnessed within your discipline's practice that you could use as the basis for reflecting on those cultural factors, things that you may be likely to encounter that you might find actually quite difficult and challenging. So use that as the basis for addressing part A. We've given you some things to consider in terms of what those cultural factors might be. So, for example, it might be around language barriers. It might be around certain behaviours. It might be particular attitudes that, you know, population groups or certain cultural groups might hold, or particular values as well. So you will need to briefly identify and describe a relevant interaction, and it does need to be linked to your profession. Okay. Now, not every student in this subject is a health student. So, for example, if you're an education student, then you link this to your practice as a teacher, for example. Okay, so we want you to make this as relevant to your discipline as you can. It doesn't have to be just about being a healthcare professional. And if in the case of, think about, teachers, that, well, education is a social determinant and thereby is linked to health. So you are, in effect, I guess, working within that healthcare space per se. For part B, you'll need to do some reflection on your own culture. And this is where, having completed that reflective task back in week 5, as part of the weekly task, we've already asked you to start reflecting on your culture. So use that and go back and perhaps revisit what your response was to that, but perhaps, spending a little bit more time reflecting on what your culture is and what values and you hold and where they come from. Okay. If you're looking for some resources, we would recommend Bin and Goonj, so by Eckermann. So that's available as an ebook in the reading list, which you can access via LMS. The other book worth looking at is Janie Dade Smith's book as well. That's not available as an ebook, but there are copies on each campus in the libraries. For part C, here you'll need to be considering the role of culture in the determinants of health and, of course, issues of equity in rural and remote Australia. So these are just some extra tips to help you to tackle this assessment. For completing part 2, so you should be in that first section, you should be demonstrating your understanding of rural culture. And as I said, we want you to extend that reflection beyond just that she'll be right attitude. We want you to explain what it means to you and how you've actually experienced rural culture, if you have. There's some really great literature out there that you can draw on. There's plenty of resources in LMS. And again, we would recommend Eckermann and Dade Smith as some key readings to help address this part of the assessment. And then finally, the table. So, it should include your learning needs. So that's based on your strengths and weaknesses that you've identified through reflection, what actions you will take to achieve them, and what resources that you might need. And this should be reflecting the day-to-day actions that you can actually take to be working in a way that is culturally competent and culturally safe. And again, you should be reflecting on those principles and steps of cultural safety. I think that's probably really all that I have to sort of say. Does anyone have any final questions before we wrap up?
No, I don't.
Yep, all good. Has this been helpful?
Yes.
Yep, excellent.
Very.
Good to hear. So my advice is that you spend a little bit of time now just going back, well, not even right now, but over the next sort of few days, going back and rereading the instructions for the assessment, having a look at that in conjunction with that marking rubric, and then going and having a look at those examples that are up on LMS and looking at the annotations associated with those. And I think this will then help you to start formulating a plan. If you do have any questions, you can post those I encourage you to post those to the discussion forum. So I'll just pull up the LMS. So just jumping into LMS, using the discussion forums that have been set up, and there is one there in particular for the reflective task. Before you do post So there's one down here for reflective task. Before you post anything, just check to make sure that your question hasn't already been asked and answered. I will be closely monitoring these, you know, in the lead up to the due date. So I'll be jumping in. Sometimes I look at these twice a day, morning and afternoon, just to see what's happening. Always try to reply within sort of the 24 hours if I can. Okay. On that note, I might leave it there. And yeah, hope that you have found this helpful at least. And I look forward to reading your cultural safety plans. Okay. All right. I'll say goodbye to you all.
Thanks, Karen.
No worries. Let us know if you've got any questions, okay? Bye.